In the forgotten cattle town of Dry Willow, where the dust settled thick as grief and hope seemed as scarce as rain, Clara Whitfield swept the same wooden floors her late husband had walked just months before. 8 months pregnant and running a cafe that barely saw 3 customers a week, she counted pennies like prayers. The drought had driven most folks away, leaving behind only the stubborn and the desperate. When old Red Foster stumbled through her door that September morning, hat in hand and pride worn thin as his coat, he spoke words that would change everything. Not just for him, not just for Clara, but for every soul who'd given up on their neighbors and themselves. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. But what Clara did next defied everything the dying town thought they knew about survival. Could one woman's impossible choice really bring an entire community back from the edge? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered cafe door creaked on its hinges as Clara paused in her sweeping, one hand pressed against the small of her aching back. The September morning sun cast long shadows across the empty tables, each one a reminder of better days, when the Dry Willow station buzzed with travelers heading west and cattlemen planning their next drives. Now, the silence stretched like the endless prairie beyond the town's borders, broken only by the whisper of her broom against the pine boards Samuel had laid with his own hands 3 years ago. She set the broom against the wall and walked slowly to the window, her swollen belly making even simple movements deliberate. Outside, Main Street lay as empty as a promise broken. The general store across the way had boarded up its windows last month, and old Murphy's saloon showed no signs of life, save for the occasional tumble of dust devils dancing past its doors. The railroad still came through twice a week, but fewer passengers bothered to disembark these days. Why would they? Dry Willow had earned its name honestly. Nothing green had grown here in 2 years, and hope seemed just as scarce. Clara's fingers found the small tin box on the windowsill, a habit she'd developed in the months since Samuel's passing. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of blue cotton from her wedding dress, lay his gold wedding band. She didn't open the box, didn't need to. The weight of it in her palm was enough to conjure his voice, warm and steady as the coffee he'd brewed every morning at 4:30 sharp. "A cafe ain't just about the food, Clara girl," he used to say, using the pet name that made her feel young even at 38. "It's about giving folks a place to rest their troubles along with their bones. You feed the body, sure enough, but sometimes feeding the spirit matters more." Samuel had been a dreamer, bless his soul. Even as the drought tightened its grip on the territory and neighbors packed up their lives in covered wagons, he'd insisted their little cafe would survive. He'd planted hope like it was a crop that would surely come in with the next rain. When the fever took him in June swift and merciless as a prairie, Fire Clara had inherited not just his debts and his dreams, but his unshakable faith in the goodness of people. That faith felt mighty thin these days. The baby shifted inside her, a firm kick against her ribs that made her smile despite everything. At least Samuel had left her a piece of himself that would grow up knowing stories about the man who'd believed a cup of coffee and a kind word could change someone's day. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the life that moved there with increasing urgency as her time drew near. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered. "Think your daddy was right about people? Think there's still some goodness left in this dried-up world?" The baby kicked again, as if in answer, and Clara laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in days. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Through the glass, she could see Doc Hartwell's familiar silhouette, his medical bag in one hand and his hat in the other. She smoothed her apronone of 3 dresses that still fit over her, expanding middle and opened the door. "Morning, Clara." Doc's weathered face creased with concern as he took in her appearance. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're faring. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned you looked peaked at church Sunday." "I'm managing fine, Doc. Come in, please." She stepped aside to let him enter, grateful for any company that didn't involve collecting debts or offering condolences. Doc Hartwell had been tending to the people of Dry Willow for nearly 20 years, arriving fresh from medical school back east with grand plans to serve the frontier. The years had silvered his hair and lined his face, but his hands remained steady and his heart even steadier. He'd delivered half the babies in 3 counties and buried their grandparents with equal care. "Coffee's still warm," Clara offered, though she knew he'd accept whether it was warm or cold. Doc had a way of making people feel less alone just by being present. "That'd be mighty kind." He settled into the chair Samuel used to favor, the one with the best view of both the kitchen and the front door. "How are you sleeping? Any more of those pains you mentioned?" Clara poured 2 cups from the pot she kept going, mostly out of habit. These days, she was lucky to serve 3 customers a day, but Samuel's voice echoed in her memory. "Always have coffee ready. You never know when someone might need it more than they need anything else in the world." "The pains come and go," she admitted, settling carefully into the chair across from him. "Nothing regular yet, but this little one's getting mighty restless." Doc nodded, sipping his coffee with the appreciation of a man who'd learned to find comfort in small rituals. First babies have their own schedule. Could be another week, could be another month. "Your mama have any trouble with her births?" The question stung, as it always did. Clara's mother had died when she was 14, taking the stories of her own birthing experiences with her. "I wouldn't know. Mama never talked much about such things before she passed." "Well, you're strong stock, Clara. Samuel always said so." Doc's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd seen enough life and death to know which words mattered. "And you won't be going through this alone. Mrs. Pemberton's been asking after you, and I suspect half the women left in town would take it as an honor to help when your time comes." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, another curse of her condition, crying at the smallest kindness. "I appreciate that, Doc. Truly, it's just." She gestured around the empty café. "Hard to feel like part of a community when there's barely any community left." Doc leaned forward, his cup cradled in both hands. "Now, that's where you're wrong. Community isn't about numbers, Clara. It's about connection. Quality over quantity, as they say. The folks who stayed in Dry Willow, they stayed because this place means something to them. Because people like you and Samuel made it mean something." Through the window, Clara watched Sheriff Morrison make his rounds, tipping his hat to Mrs. Pemberton as she swept her front porch. The gesture was small, automatic, but it spoke to the threads that still bound their little town together. Morrison had been offered a position in Abilene twice in the past year, better pay, more prestige, but he'd stayed. Mrs. Pemberton could have moved in with her sister in Kansas City after her husband died, but she'd stayed too. Maybe Doc was right. Maybe community wasn't about the numbers. Samuel used to say that a single candle could light up a whole room if the room was dark enough. Clara mused. Maybe that's what we are now, just a few candles, but burning bright enough to matter. That sounds like something Samuel would say. Doc smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Man had a poet's heart wrapped up in a rancher's practical sense. Rare combination. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 people who'd learned that sometimes the best conversations happened in the spaces between words. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending more dust devils spinning down Main Street. But inside the cafe, with its mismatched chairs and coffee-stained counter, the warmth lingered like a promise. "Doc," Clara said eventually, "what happens if—" She stopped, afraid to voice the fear that had been growing along with the baby. "What happens if I can't keep this place going? If I can't be what Samuel was?" Doc set down his cup and reached across the table to cover her hand with his. His fingers were warm, steady hands of someone who'd caught newborns and closed the eyes of the dying with equal reverence. "Clara Whitfield, you listen to me. You don't need to be what Samuel was. You need to be what Clara is. And what Clara is a woman with enough courage to keep her doors open when everyone else is closing theirs. A woman who makes coffee for whoever might need it, whether that's 3 people or 30. A woman who's about to bring new life into this world because she believes in tomorrow, even when today looks mighty bleak. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Clara felt something shift inside her, not physically, but deeper, a recognition, maybe, or a remembering of who she'd been before grief and worry had clouded her vision. "Thank you, Doc. I needed to hear that." We all need reminding sometimes. He stood, gathering his hat and bag. "I'll check on you again in a few days. And Clara, if those pains get regular, you send someone for me right away. Day or night, it doesn't matter." After he left, Clara returned to her sweeping, but her movements felt different now, purposeful, rather than merely routine. The café was still empty, the town still struggling, the future still uncertain. But something had changed in the conversation, some small seed of possibility that hadn't been there before. She swept her way toward the front door, planning to prop it open despite the dust. Samuel had always kept the door open during business hours, claiming it made people feel more welcome. As she reached for the handle, a shadow fell across the threshold. A man stood there, hat in hand, his clothes dusty from travel, and his face etched with the kind of weariness that went deeper than tired muscles. He was older 60, maybe more, with silver stubble and eyes that had seen more hard roads than easy ones. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper, "I don't mean to bother you, but—" He paused, swallowing hard, and Clara could see the effort it took for him to continue. "I ain't eaten in 2 days, and I was wondering if you might have some work I could do for a meal. I'm good with my hands, and I don't eat much." Clara looked at him, really looked, and saw past the dust and desperation to the dignity he was fighting to maintain. Here was a man who could have begged, could have demanded, could have taken what he needed without asking. Instead, he stood at her threshold with his hat in his hands, offering honest work for honest food. In that moment, Clara heard Samuel's voice as clear as if he were standing beside her. "You feed the body, sure enough, but sometimes feeding the spirit matters more." She looked at the man again, at his proud shoulders and downcast eyes, and felt something stir in her chest, not just sympathy, but recognition. They were both holding on by threads, both trying to maintain their dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Ephraim Foster, ma'am, but most folks call me Red." He gestured to what remained of his rust-colored hair. "And I'm mighty grateful you'd even consider." Clara held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. In that moment, looking at Red Foster's weathered face and remembering Doc Hartwell's words about community and candles in dark rooms, she made a decision that would change everything. Not just for Red, not just for herself, but for every soul in Dry Willow who'd forgotten what it meant to be part of something bigger than their own struggles. Clara studied Red Foster's face, seeing past the dust and desperation to something that reminded her of Samuel's quiet dignity. The tattered hat in his hands, once a fine piece of craftsmanship, now bearing the scars of hard years and harder choice, trembled slightly as he waited for her answer. "Red Foster," she repeated, tasting the name. "You wouldn't happen to be the same Red Foster who used to work the Lazy J Ranch up north?" His eyes widened with surprise. "Yes, ma'am, though that was some years back. How'd you—" "Samuel mentioned you once. Said you were the finest horsebreaker he'd ever seen." Clara stepped aside, gesturing him into the café. "Come in out of the dust. We'll talk about that work." Red hesitated at the threshold, his weathered hands turning the hat brim over and over. "Ma'am, I appreciate your kindness, but I should be honest. I ain't looking for charity. A man's got to earn his way, even when times are hard." The words struck something deep in Clara's chest. Here was a man who'd walked into town with nothing but his pride and the clothes on his back, yet he spoke of earning his way like it was a sacred thing. Samuel would have liked, that would have respected it. "Mr. Foster, Red, come inside and sit down, please." Her voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "We'll discuss the work, but first, let me get you some water. You look like you've been walking a long time." He followed her inside, moving with the careful gait of someone whose boots had seen too many miles of hard ground. Clara poured water from the pitcher she kept beside the coffee pot, watching as he drank deeply, but not greedily, even his thirst tempered by dignity. "Thank you, ma'am. That's mighty kind." He set the glass down gently, as if afraid it might break. "Now, about that work. When did you last eat?" Clara asked directly, settling into the chair across from him with some difficulty. The baby seemed to sense the tension in the room, moving restlessly against her ribs. Red's jaw tightened. "Day before yesterday. Had some jerky that morning." 2 days. Clara felt something shift inside her, the same feeling she'd had when Doc Hartwell spoke about community and candles in dark rooms. "Red, can I ask you something?" "Yes, ma'am." "If our situations were reversed, if I came to you hungry and asking for work, what would you do?" He didn't hesitate. "I'd feed you first, ma'am. Work could wait." Clara nodded slowly, her hands folding over her belly. "That's what I thought you'd say." That's what Samuel would have said too. She stood, her movements deliberate despite her condition. "Stay right there." She walked to the kitchen, her mind racing. The till behind the counter held this week's meager earnings, maybe $8 in coins and crumpled bills. Not much, but it was all she had between now and destitution. The sensible thing would be to offer Red a simple meal, maybe some leftover biscuits and coffee, in exchange for whatever work he could manage. But as Clara looked around the empty cafe, at the tables that had once buzzed with conversation, at the kitchen where Samuel had cooked for anyone who needed feeding, she heard his voice again. Sometimes, feeding the spirit matters more. She walked to the counter, lifted the heavy iron till, and carried it back to where Red sat. His eyes widened as she set it down on the table between them with a decisive thunk. "Ma'am, what are you?" Clara lifted the lid and turned the till upside down. Coins scattered across the wooden table, silver dollars, quarters, dimes, and nickels mixing with the few paper bills that represented a week's worth of careful saving. Red stared at the money as if she'd just produced a snake from her apron pocket. "Miss Ma'am, I don't understand." "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "This cafe belonged to my late husband Samuel, and now it belongs to me. That money there, that's everything I've earned this week. Not much by most standards, but it's what we have." Red's face had gone pale beneath the dust and stubble. "Mrs. Whitfield, if you're trying to give me money, I can't accept." "I'm not giving you anything," Clara interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I'm making you a business proposition." She gestured toward the kitchen. "See that stove? Those pots and pans? This cafe used to feed 30, 40 people on a busy day. Now we're lucky to see 3 customers." "Yes, ma'am, but I don't see how." Clara stood and walked to the front door, her hand on the handle. "Red Foster, you said you hadn't eaten in 2 days. How many other men do you suppose are walking these roads in the same condition? How many folks in this very town are going to bed hungry because they're too proud to ask for help?" Understanding began to dawn in Red's weathered features. "You're talking about feeding more than just me." "I'm talking about feeding everyone." Clara's voice grew stronger with each word. "Every drifter, every traveler, every soul in Dry Willow who's too proud to admit they're hungry. We're going to take this money, buy enough food to fill this place with the smell of real cooking, and we're going to announce to anyone within earshot that there's a feast happening right here." Red stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am Clara, that's awful generous, but that money you got there, it won't stretch to feed more than a few folks. And what happens tomorrow? Next week?" Clara placed both hands on her belly, feeling the baby's strong movements, as if the child was responding to her excitement. "I don't know what happens tomorrow, Red. But I know what happens today. Today, we turn this empty cafe into what Samuel always said it should be, place where people can rest their troubles along with their bones. But your baby, your future, my baby is going to be born into a world where I chose hope over fear," Clara said firmly. "Where I chose community over self-preservation. Maybe that's foolish, but it's what Samuel would have done." Red picked up one of the silver dollars, turning it over in his calloused fingers. "You sure about this? Once word gets out, there's no taking it back." Clara walked to the kitchen window and looked out at Main Street, empty, dusty, defeated. Then she imagined it filled with the sound of voices, the smell of cooking, the warmth of people coming together around shared need and shared plenty. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She turned back to Red, her decision crystallizing like ice on a winter morning. "Will you help me?" Red stood slowly, his tattered hat still clutched in one hand, the silver dollar in the other. For a long moment, he studied her face, as if trying to determine whether she was serious or simply addled by pregnancy and grief. "Ma'am Clara, I've been riding these trails for more years than I care to count. I've seen good people do foolish things, and I've seen foolish people accidentally do good. What you're proposing, it's either the most generous thing I've ever witnessed or the most reckless." "Maybe both," Clara admitted. Red set the silver dollar back on the table and placed his hat on his head. For a terrible moment, Clara thought he was going to walk away, going to leave her with her scattered money and her impossible dream. Instead, he extended his hand. "Then let's get cooking." Clara shook his hand, feeling the calluses earned through decades of honest work. "We'll need supplies. The general store might have some flour and beans left, maybe some salt pork." "I know where to get coffee cheap," Red offered. "And there's a farmer outside town owes me a favor, might have some vegetables he can spare." As they began planning their impossible feast, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death, the electric thrill of purpose, of moving towards something instead of merely surviving. The baby kicked enthusiastically, as if approving of the adventure ahead. Neither of them spoke of the risks, of what would happen when the money ran out, of how they would explain this madness to the practical-minded folks of Dry Willow. Instead, they focused on the immediate, how much food they could buy, how many people they might feed, how to transform an empty café into a place of abundance. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and sending dust devils spinning down Main Street. But inside, Clara Whitfield and Red Foster began planning a miracle that would start with scattered coins and end with something neither of them could yet imagine. The cast-iron pot had been gathering dust in the storage room for months, hidden behind sacks of cornmeal and forgotten dreams. Clara ran her fingers along its familiar surface, remembering the countless meals Samuel had prepared in this very vessel stews that could feed a dozen hungry men. Beans that simmered all day until they were tender as promises. This was his favorite, she told Red as they wrestled the heavy pot onto the stove. Said it held flavor better than any fancy cookware from back east. Red nodded appreciatively, his experienced eye taking in the pot's solid construction. Man knew his tools. "This here's built to last." He paused, studying Clara's face. "You sure you're up for this kind of cooking? In your condition, I mean." Clara felt a sharp twinge in her lower back, but pushed through it. "I've been cooking in this kitchen for 3 years, Red. Pregnant or not, I know my way around these pots and pans." They had returned from their shopping expedition with arms full of supplies: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and a surprising array of vegetables from the farmer Red had mentioned. The man had not only honored Red's favor, but had thrown in extra potatoes and onions, claiming they were going to spoil anyway. Clara suspected kindness rather than practicality, but she hadn't argued. Now, as they began the preparation, Clara found herself moving with an energy she hadn't felt in months. Her hands knew the rhythm of cooking large quantities the way flour felt when properly mixed, the sound of onions sizzling in bacon fat, the exact moment when beans needed their water adjusted. "What do you think?" she asked Red as she stirred the developing stew. "Will anyone actually come?" Red was chopping vegetables with surprising precision, his weathered hands steady despite their obvious familiarity with ropes and reins rather than kitchen knives. "Oh, they'll come. Word travels fast in a small town, especially word about free food. Question is whether they'll stay once they get here." As if summoned by his words, the first tentative knock came at the door. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly racing. Through the glass, she could see 2 figures: a woman in a faded blue dress, with a small child clinging to her skirts. "Mrs. Jameson," Clara breathed, recognizing the young widow who'd been struggling since her husband died in a ranch accident last spring. And little Tommy. Clara opened the door to find Sarah Jameson's thin face etched with uncertainty. The woman was barely 25, but hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her son Tommy peered out from behind her skirts, his dark eyes wide with curiosity. "Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah said hesitantly. "I heard that is Mrs. Pemberton mentioned." She stopped, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I don't want to intrude, but Tommy hasn't had a proper meal in 2 days, and I thought maybe—" "Sarah Jameson, you come right in here," Clara said firmly, taking the woman's arm. "And bring that boy of yours. We've got more food cooking than 2 people could eat in a week." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in the scene, the large pot bubbling on the stove, the smell of coffee and cooking onions, the table still scattered with Clara's sacrificed earnings. "Mrs. Whitfield, I can't accept charity. I have some mending I could do, or I could help with the cooking." "You can help by setting the table," Clara interrupted gently. "Red, this is Sarah Jameson and her son Tommy. Sarah, this is Red Foster. He's helping me with this endeavor." Red tipped his hat to Sarah, then knelt to Tommy's eye level. "Howdy, partner, you hungry?" Tommy nodded solemnly, still clinging to his mother's skirts, but clearly intrigued by the kindly stranger. "Well then, you're in luck. Miss Clara here is the finest cook in 3 counties, and we're fixing to have ourselves a proper feast." As Sarah reluctantly allowed herself to be drawn into the preparation, more figures appeared outside the cafe windows. An elderly man Clara recognized as Mr. C. Henley, who lived in a shack behind the abandoned grain elevator. 2 younger men in trail clothes, their horses tied to the post outside. A woman with graying hair and worn but clean clothes, carrying a cloth bundle in her arms. "Looks like word's spreading," Red observed, glancing out the window. Clara felt a flutter of panic mixed with excitement. "We don't have enough chairs for everyone." "We'll make do," Red said calmly. "People can sit on flour sacks, lean against the walls. When folks are truly hungry, they don't much care about the accommodations." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Clara found herself orchestrating the controlled chaos of preparing a meal for an unknown number of people, her pregnancy temporarily forgotten in the rush of purpose. Red proved invaluable, not just for his strong back and willing hands, but for his easy way with the strangers who continued to drift through the door. Sarah Jameson, initially hesitant, gradually warmed to the task of helping serve. Her son Tommy appointed himself official pot stirrer, standing on a wooden crate to reach the stove, while Red kept a protective eye on him. "More coffee," Clara called out as she ladled stew into mismatched bowls. "And someone sliced that bread thicker. These folks look like they could use some substance." The cafe, which had stood empty and echoing for months, suddenly pulsed with life. Conversation flowed around the tables as strangers found themselves elbow to elbow, with neighbors they'd barely acknowledged in harder times. The woman with the cloth bundle, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd moved to town after her husband's death, had brought fresh tortillas that she shared, without being asked. "This is something," Red murmured to Clara, as they worked side by side at the stove. "Haven't seen anything like it since the old days, when trail drives would come through, and everyone in town would pitch in to feed the cowboys." Clara paused in her stirring, looking around at the transformed space. Old Mr. Henley was telling Tommy stories about the early days of Dry Willow, his weathered hands gesturing animatedly. The 2 trail riders were sharing their coffee with Sarah, who was laughing at something one of them had said, the first genuine laughter Clara had heard from the young widow in months. "It's working," she said softly, hardly believing it herself. "Course it's working," Red replied, but his voice carried its own note of wonder. "You give people food and fellowship. They remember what it means to be human. Problem is, most folks forget that being human is something you have to practice." A sharp pain in Clara's lower back made her gasp, and she had to grip the counter for support. Red immediately noticed, his weathered face creasing with concern. "You overdoing it?" "I'm fine," Clara insisted, though the pain was stronger than before. "Just need to sit down for a minute." But as she looked around at the crowded cafe, at the faces bright with unexpected joy, at the child who was finally getting a proper meal, Clara realized she didn't want to sit down. She wanted to keep cooking, keep serving, keep this impossible moment alive for as long as possible. The baby kicked hard, as if reminding her that some things couldn't be postponed indefinitely. Clara placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life moving there with increasing urgency. "Soon," she whispered to the child within. "But not yet. Let Mama finish this first." The flour sack arrived, like salvation wrapped in burlap. Clara heard the commotion outside before she saw Mrs. Pemberton struggling with the heavy burden, her face set with the determination of someone who'd made up her mind about something important. "Abigail Pemberton," Clara called through the open door, "what on earth are you doing with that flour?" Mrs. Pemberton, a sturdy woman of 60, who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children on grit and prayer, hefted the sack with surprising strength. "I'm contributing to this madness of yours, Clara Whitfield. Now stop asking questions and help me get this inside before my back gives out." Red immediately appeared at Mrs. Pemberton's side, taking the flour sack from her arms with a grateful nod. "Much obliged, ma'am. This here's going to make a difference." "I should hope so," Mrs. Pemberton said briskly, dusting off her hands. "Cost me $3, and that's my egg money for the month." She paused, her sharp eyes taking in the transformed café. "Though I suppose if we're going to feed half the territory, we'll need more than good intentions." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, those troublesome pregnancy emotions again. "Abigail, you didn't have to?" "Course I didn't have to. That's what makes it worthwhile." Mrs. Pemberton moved through the crowded café with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. "Now who's in charge of the bread? Because what I'm seeing here won't stretch to feed all these folks properly." The question hung in the air for a moment before Sarah Jameson, still tentative but growing bolder, raised her hand. "I could help with baking. I used to help my mother run a boarding house before I married." "Excellent." Mrs. Pemberton clapped her hands together. "Red, you seem handy with that knife. Think you could manage some cornbread to go with the bread? And Clara, dear, you need to sit down before you fall down. You're white as a sheet." Clara wanted to protest, but another sharp pain in her back made the decision for her. She sank into the nearest chair, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other resting on her belly. Around her, the café continued its miraculous transformation, as Mrs. Pemberton took charge with the natural authority of someone who'd spent decades managing family gatherings and church socials. "Tommy," Mrs. Pemberton called to Sarah's son, "you come help me organize these supplies. We're going to need more plates, more cups, and definitely more chairs." "We don't have more chairs," Clara said weakly. "Then we'll make do with what we have." Mrs. Pemberton replied firmly. "People sat on stumps and wagon tongues during the harvest dinners when I was young. They'll survive a little discomfort for a good meal." As if summoned by the mention of chairs, Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with curiosity and concern. Behind him came Doc Hartwell, drawn by the unusual activity and the smell of cooking food. "Clara," Doc said immediately, moving to her side with his medical bag. "What's all this commotion, and why do you look like you're about to deliver that baby right here in the café?" "I'm fine, Doc," Clara insisted, though the pain in her back was becoming more persistent. "Just a little tired from all the cooking." Doc's experienced hands found her pulse, his touch gentle but firm. "How long have you been having pains?" "They're not pains exactly, just—" Another sharp twinge cut off her words, and she gripped the chair arms tightly. "Uh-huh." Doc's expression grew serious. "Sheriff, think you could help organize this crowd? I need to examine Clara properly." "Hold on there, Doc," Sheriff Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Before anyone gets examined, I need to understand what's happening here. Clara, folks in town are saying you're giving away free food to anyone who asks. That true?" Clara looked around at the faces, watching her, some curious, some grateful, some skeptical. Red stepped forward, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him. "Sheriff, Mrs. Whitfield here offered me work for a meal. When I told her I hadn't eaten in 2 days, she decided to cook for anyone else who might be in the same situation. Seemed like a neighborly thing to do. Neighborly may be, Sheriff Morrison said slowly, but also expensive. Clara, you sure you know what you're getting into? Word travels fast in small towns. By tomorrow, you might have 50 people expecting a free meal. Mrs. Pemberton looked up from where she was directing the bread-making operation. James Morrison, shame on you. This girl is doing what any decent Christian should do, feeding the hungry. Instead of discouraging her, you should be helping. I'm not discouraging anyone, Abigail. I'm being practical. Clara's got a baby coming and a business to run. Good intentions don't pay the bills. Bills don't pay the soul either, Red said quietly, but his voice carried through the cafe. Sometimes a person has to choose between what's practical and what's right. Doc Hartwell, who'd been quietly monitoring Clara's condition, stood up with a thoughtful expression. You know, Sheriff, I've been thinking about this community lately, about what we've lost and what we still have. Maybe what Clara's doing isn't just about feeding people. Maybe it's about remembering what community means. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cafe. Old Mr. Henley, who'd been quietly enjoying his first proper meal in weeks, nodded emphatically. Doc's right. Haven't felt this much like a real town in years. But how do we sustain it? Sheriff Morrison asked, his practical nature still asserting itself. What happens next week, next month? The question hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt the weight of it pressing down on her like the approaching storm she could smell on the wind. She'd acted on impulse, on faith, on the desperate need to do something meaningful in a world that seemed determined to strip away hope. But the sheriff was right. Good intentions didn't pay bills or put food on the table long term. We'll figure it out, she said finally, her voice stronger than she felt. Maybe people contribute what they can when they can. Maybe we find other ways to make it work, but I'm not sorry I did it. Mrs. Pemberton looked up from her bread-making flour, dusting her apron. Clara Whitfield, you've got more backbone than sense, and that's exactly what this town needs. I say we make this a regular thing every week, same time. People bring what they can, share what they have. A weekly feast, Sarah Jameson said softly, her eyes brightening. Like the old church dinners, but for everyone. Including the folks who don't have a church, Red added, his meaning clear. Doc Hartwell smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. I like it, a weekly reminder that we're all in this together. Sheriff Morrison looked around at the faces, watching him hopeful, determined, united in a way he hadn't seen in years. Slowly he nodded. Well, I suppose if we're going to do this, we'll need to do it right. Make sure everyone knows the rules. Keep things orderly. Clara felt the baby kick strongly, as if approving of the plan. Despite the pain in her back, despite the uncertainty of the future, she felt something she hadn't experienced in Monthshope, real and tangible, as the flour sack Mrs. Pemberton had carried through the door. So it's settled then, Clara said, looking around at the faces that had become her community. Every week, we feast together. Everyone welcome. Everyone contributes what they can. The cheer that went up from the cafe was small but heartfelt. The sound of people choosing hope over fear, community over isolation. Outside, the wind continued to blow dust down Main Street. But inside, something new had taken root, fragile as a seedling, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Doc Hartwell's medical bag had seen better days, the leather cracked from years of house calls across the territory, the brass fittings tarnished by weather and wear. But the instruments inside remained sharp, clean, and ready for whatever emergencies arose in a frontier town where the nearest hospital was 3 days' ride away. Let me take a look at that cut, Mr. Henley, Doc said gently, opening his bag beside the table where the elderly man sat. Looks like you tangled with something sharp. Old Mr. Henley extended his gnarled hand, where a jagged cut across his palm oozed slowly. Broke a jar trying to clean up my place for company. Been living like a hermit so long, I forgot what it was like to have folks over. As Doc cleaned and bandaged the wound, Clara noticed how the simple act of tending to someone's injury had drawn a small crowd. Mrs. Rodriguez held Tommy Jameson on her lap while his mother helped with the bread, and even the two trail riders had moved closer, curious about the medical procedure. "There," Doc said, securing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Keep it clean and dry. Come see me in a few days if it shows any signs of infection." "Much obliged, Doc," Mr. Henley said, flexing his fingers carefully. "How much do I owe you?" Doc waved dismissively. "Consider it part of the community service. Besides, I'm getting fed better here than I have in months." The interaction sparked something. Clara hadn't expected other people began sharing their own minor ailments and concerns. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned her persistent cough. Sarah Jameson asked about Tommy's recurring stomach troubles, and one of the trail riders showed Doc a suspicious-looking rash on his forearm. "Seems like you're running a clinic along with your café," Red observed quietly to Clara as she watched Doc move from person to person with unhurried care. "I hadn't thought of it that way," Clara admitted, one hand pressed to her lower back where the persistent ache had settled. "But it makes sense. People don't just need food, they need tending to." Red studied her face with the keen observation of someone who'd learned to read the signs of trouble on the trail. "Speaking of tending to, you look like you could use some yourself. That pain getting worse?" Clara started to deny it, then stopped. The contractions, because that's what they were, she could no longer pretend otherwise, were coming more regularly now, though still far apart. "Maybe a little, but this is too important to—" "Nothing's more important than you and that baby," Red interrupted firmly. "Doc needs to take a look at you proper, like." Before Clara could protest, a new commotion arose from the other side of the cafe. Voices were rising, and she could see Mrs. Pemberton's face flushing with indignation as she faced off with one of the trail riders. "I don't care what happened 10 years ago, Walt Garrison," Mrs. Pemberton was saying, her voice sharp with old anger. "You had no right to spread those lies about my Henry." The trail rider, apparently Walt Garrison, stood with his hat pushed back on his head, his own face reddening. "They weren't lies, Abigail. Your Henry sold me a horse with a bowed tendon and claimed it was sound. Cost me a season's work when the animal went lame. Henry never sold a dishonest horse in his life." Mrs. Pemberton shot back. "You probably rode that poor animal into the ground with your rough handling." The cafe fell silent as the old feud erupted into the present moment. Clara felt her heart sink just when everything had been going so well. The past was threatening to tear apart the fragile community they'd been building. Sheriff Morrison started to stand, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge, but Red caught his arm. "Let it play out," Red said quietly. "Sometimes folks need to clear the air before they can breathe easy together." Doc Hartwell, still holding his stethoscope, looked up from examining Mrs. Rodriguez's cough. "Walt, Abigail, you're both good people who've had hard times. Maybe this isn't the place for old grievances." "With respect, Doc," Walt said, his voice tight with old hurt. "Some things don't just go away because you want them to. I lost everything that year, had to take work as a common ranch hand instead of running my own operation." "Mrs. Pemberton's face softened slightly, though her chin remained defiant. "And I lost my husband 6 months later, wondering if the stress of being called a cheat contributed to his heart giving out." The silence stretched painful and tense. Clara found herself holding her breath, watching two people who'd carried their pain for a decade, letting it fester like an untended wound. Then Tommy Jameson, who'd been quietly playing with wooden spoons at his mother's feet, looked up at the feuding adults with the solemn wisdom of a child who'd seen too much hardship. "My papa used to say that being mad all the time was like carrying rocks in your pockets," he said in his clear, small voice. "Makes it harder to walk where you want to go." The simple observation hit the room like a bell tolling. Walt Garrison stared down at the boy, his expression slowly changing. Mrs. Pemberton's rigid posture began to soften. "Out of the mouths of babes," Doc murmured, but his voice carried clearly in the quiet cafe. Walt removed his hat entirely, running his fingers through his graying hair. Maybe we both lost something that year, Abigail. Maybe blame won't bring any of it back. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes filled with tears she'd probably been holding back for years. Henry always said you were a decent man, Walt, even when things went bad between you two. Said you'd been dealt a rough hand and were just trying to make the best of it. I never knew that, Walt said softly. He didn't want the whole town choosing sides, said it wasn't good for anybody. Mrs. Pemberton wiped her eyes with her apron. Maybe he was right. Clara watched as the two old adversaries looked at each other across the café, seeing perhaps for the first time in years not enemies but fellow travelers on a hard road. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass, until Walt extended his weathered hand. I'm sorry for your loss, Abigail. Henry was a good man, whatever our differences. Mrs. Pemberton took his hand without hesitation. And I'm sorry you lost your operation, Walt. That must have been terrible hard. The handshake lasted longer than mere courtesy required, and Clara felt something shift in the room, not just between Walt and Abigail, but among all the gathered people. They'd witnessed something important, the possibility that old wounds could heal, that forgiveness could triumph over resentment. Now then, Mrs. Pemberton said briskly, returning to her usual no-nonsense manner, Walt Garrison, you look like you know your way around a kitchen. Think you could help me with these biscuits? Walt grinned, the expression transforming his weathered features. Be my pleasure, Abigail. Always did like your baking. As the two former enemies began working side by side, the cafe's atmosphere lightened perceptibly. Conversations resumed, laughter returned, and the sense of community grew stronger for having weathered its first real test. Red appeared at Clara's elbow with a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. That was something to see. You all right? You look a mite peaked. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, though another contraction made her wince as she lifted the cup. I'm fine. Just thinking about what Tommy said about carrying rocks in your pockets. Makes a person wonder what rocks we all carry around without realizing it. Wise boy, Red agreed. Sounds like his papa was a thoughtful man. He was, Sarah Jameson said, appearing beside them with flour on her hands and hope in her voice. Jim always had a way of seeing past the surface of things. Said people mostly acted mean because they were scared or hurting. Doc Hartwell approached, his medical bag in one hand and a determined expression on his face. Clara, I've tended to everyone else who needs attention. Now it's your turn. Those aren't just backaches you're having, are they? Clara looked around at the transformed cafe, at the people who'd found their way to community through her impulsive act of generosity. She didn't want to leave, didn't want to miss whatever happened next in this miraculous day. But another contraction, stronger than before, made the decision for her. The community ledger was nothing more than an old accounting book Clara had found in Samuel's desk, its pages yellowed with age and its margins filled with his careful notations about coffee purchases and flour deliveries. But as she opened it to a fresh page, smoothing her hand across the clean paper, it felt like something momentous, the beginning of a promise that would outlast this single day. Weekly community feast. She wrote carefully at the top of the page, her handwriting flowing despite the persistent ache in her lower back. September 15th, 1892, first gathering. Red peered over her shoulder as she worked, his weathered face thoughtful. Making it official, are we? Someone needs to keep track, Clara said, pausing as another mild contraction tightened across her belly. If we're really going to do this every week, we'll need to know what works, what doesn't, how many people to expect. She began listing the attendees: Sarah and Tommy Jameson, Mrs. Pemberton, Walt Garrison, the Rodriguez family, old Mr. Henley, Doc Hartwell, Sheriff Morrison, the two other trail riders whose names she'd learned were Jake and Ben. 15 people in total, not counting herself and Red. 15 souls, she murmured, then added in the margin. Contributions: Mrs. Pemberton, flour sack, 50 albs, Mrs. Rodriguez, fresh tortillas, Walt Garrison, stories and reconciliation, Mr. Henley, gratitude and company. You counting stories as contributions? Red asked with a gentle smile. Why not? Tommy's been entertained for an hour listening to Mr. Henley talk about the old days. That's worth something. Clara continued writing, documenting not just the practical details, but the intangible gifts people had brought. Sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars and cents. As she worked, the conversations around her continued to evolve. What had started as strangers sharing a meal was becoming something deeper: people discovering connections they hadn't known existed, sharing stories that revealed common struggles and unexpected wisdom. Jake, one of the trail riders, was telling Sarah about work opportunities at ranches to the south, where a widow with her skills might find steady employment. Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching Mrs. Pemberton Spanish phrases while they worked together on the tortillas. Walt Garrison had somehow ended up in deep conversation with Sheriff Morrison about the changes they'd both seen in their long years on the frontier. "Look at that," Red said softly, nodding toward where Tommy Jameson sat beside old Mr. Henley, both of them working on whittling small figures from pieces of scrap wood. Boys found himself a grandfather, and the old man's found himself a purpose. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, those troublesome pregnancy emotions that seemed to surface at the smallest kindness. But watching the unlikely friendship blossom between the lonely old hermit and the fatherless boy, she thought maybe tears were appropriate. Some moments deserved to be felt deeply. "Next week," she said, returning to her ledger, "we'll need more chairs, and probably more coffee. Maybe we should ask folks to bring their own cups and plates." "Good thinking," Red agreed. "Make it more like a church social where everyone contributes something, even if it's just their own dishes." Doc Hartwell approached their table, his medical bag closed, and his expression satisfied. "Well, I've pronounced everyone in this room remarkably healthy for a group that's been living on hardship and determination. Mrs. Rodriguez's cough is just dust from the drought. Tommy's stomach troubles will clear up now that he's getting regular meals, and that rash on Ben's arm is nothing more than contact with some irritating plant." He settled into the chair across from Clara, his keen physician's eyes studying her face. "Now, about you. How far apart are those contractions?" Clara glanced around the bustling café, reluctant to admit that her body was demanding attention when so much was happening around her. "Maybe 20 minutes? They're not too strong yet." "Yet being the operative word," Doc said firmly. "First babies can be unpredictable, Clara. We need to be prepared." Mrs. Pemberton, who'd been eavesdropping while organizing the kitchen, appeared at their table with the authority of someone who'd attended more births than she cared to count. "Doc's right, dear. I helped deliver 3 of my neighbor's babies, and the first one came faster than anyone expected. But the feast, the community," Clara gestured around the room. "I can't leave now. What if people need something? What if this falls apart?" Red placed a calloused hand over hers on the ledger. "Clara, you've started something here that's bigger than any one person. Look around, these folks don't need you to keep them together anymore. They've found their own reasons to stay." As if to prove his point, Sarah Jameson stood up from where she'd been working on bread dough, her face flushed with more animation than Clara had seen since her husband's death. "Everyone," Sarah called out, her voice carrying clearly through the cafe, "Mrs. Whitfield has done something wonderful here today, but I think we all know this needs to be bigger than one person's efforts. If we're really going to make this a weekly tradition, we all need to take responsibility." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Walt Garrison nodded emphatically. "Sarah's right. Can't expect one pregnant woman to carry the whole load, especially with a baby coming." "I can handle the coffee," Ben offered from his spot by the window. "My outfit comes through here regular-like. We could bring beans from town." "And I can coordinate the cooking," Mrs. Pemberton added. "Lord knows I've organized enough church dinners to feed half the county." Sheriff Morrison stood, his badge catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. "If we're going to make this official, we should probably set some ground rules. Times, expectations, that sort of thing." Clara watched in amazement as her spontaneous act of generosity transformed into something organized and sustainable. The community ledger in front of her was no longer just her record-keeping, it was becoming a charter, a constitution for something unprecedented in Dry Willow's history. Every Saturday, she said, writing as she spoke, 4 o'clock until sunset. Everyone brings something to share: food, supplies, labor, stories. No one goes hungry, no one gets turned away. And no one person carries the whole burden, Red added firmly. This works because everyone contributes according to their means. Doc Hartwell pulled out his pocket watch, checking the time with a slight frown. Speaking of time, Clara, those contractions are getting closer together. I can see it in the way you're holding yourself. Clara looked down at the ledger, at the names and notes that represented something she'd never dared dream possible. The baby inside her kicked strongly, as if impatient to be born into this world her mother was helping to create. One more entry, she said, her pen moving carefully across the page. Resolution. This weekly gathering shall continue as long as there are people who need community and care. May it serve as a reminder that in the hardest times, we find our truest selves through service to others. She closed the ledger and looked around the room one more time at Tommy learning to whittle, at Mrs. Pemberton and Walt Garrison working side by side as if their decade-long feud had never existed, at Sarah Jameson organizing volunteers with newfound confidence, at Red Foster standing ready to help with whatever came next. "All right, Doc," she said finally. Another contraction, making her decision for her. "I think it's time." The announcement sent a ripple of excitement and concern through the cafe. People began organizing themselves without being asked. Mrs. Pemberton took charge of cleaning up the kitchen. Sarah gathered the leftover food to distribute among those who needed it most. And Red appointed himself Clara's official escort to wherever Doc thought she should go. The back room, Doc decided. More privacy there, and closer to supplies if we need them. As Clara stood, the community ledger in her hands, she felt a profound sense of completion. Not ending, but fulfillment, as if everything that had led to this moment had been part of a larger design she was only now beginning to understand. The baby was ready to be born into a world where strangers had become neighbors, where old wounds had been healed, and where hope had taken root in the most unlikely soil. It seemed like perfect timing. The hidden letter fell from between the pages of Samuel's old Bible like a whisper from the past. Clara had been looking for her mother's bookmarker, pressed wildflower she'd kept as a remembrance, when the folded paper fluttered to the floor of the back room where Doc Hartwell was preparing for the birth. "What's that?" Red asked, noticing her sudden stillness as she stared at the paper. Another contraction was building, but Clara found herself frozen by the sight of Samuel's careful handwriting on the outside fold. "For Clara, when the time is right." "It's from Samuel," she whispered, her hands shaking as she unfolded the letter. "But why would he hide it in his Bible?" Doc Hartwell looked up from arranging his instruments, his expression gentle but concerned. "Clara, whatever it is can wait. Right now we need to focus on—" "No," Clara said firmly, though another contraction made her grip the letter tightly. "He wrote this for me to find. There must be a reason." She began to read aloud, her voice growing stronger as Samuel's familiar words filled the room. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then God has called me home before I could tell you everything you need to know about the cafe, about our life here, and about the choices I've been making these past months. I pray you'll forgive me for keeping secrets, but I knew your generous heart would worry, and worry is the last thing I wanted to give you along with a child to raise." Clara paused, looking up at Red and Doc with confusion. "Secrets? What secrets?" She continued reading. "The cafe hasn't been profitable for over a year, my darling. The drought, the failing cattle drives, the people moving away, we've been losing money steadily. But I couldn't bear to close our doors because I knew what this place meant to folks who had nowhere else to go. So I've been using our savings and sometimes borrowing against future earnings to keep us running. Not for the business, Clara, but for the people." "Samuel," Clara breathed, her heart racing with more than just the approaching birth. "You never said—" "There's more," Red observed quietly, reading over her shoulder. Clara's voice wavered as she continued. "I've been keeping careful records of every person we've helped, every meal we've given to someone who couldn't pay, every time we've been a refuge for the desperate and the lonely. Mrs. Henderson, when her husband left her with 3 children and no money. The Johnson boys, when their father was killed in that mining accident. Old Pete Miller, who hasn't been able to pay for a meal in 2 years but keeps our front steps swept and our windows clean in exchange for coffee and conversation. Red Foster too, I know Red, and I know you'll likely meet him someday when he drifts back through town. Clara's eyes widened. You knew Red, but how? Red's weathered face had gone pale. Clara, I need to tell you something. Samuel didn't just know me, saved my life once. 3 years ago, when I was down to my last penny and hadn't eaten in a week, I was ready to well, I was in a dark place. Your husband found me behind the livery stable, gave me work and food, and never asked questions about why a man my age was traveling alone with nothing but the clothes on his back. The contraction that hit Clara then was strong enough to make her double over, but she kept reading through gritted teeth. The point, my beloved, is that every dollar we've lost has been an investment in something more valuable than money. We've been building community, one meal at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The cafe may not be profitable, but it's been profitable to the soul of this town. Doc Hartwell moved to Clara's side, his professional concern overriding the drama of the moment. Clara, we really need to. Wait, she gasped, holding up a hand. There's more. I know you'll worry about money after I'm gone, about how to keep the cafe running, about providing for our child. But I want you to know that what you're inheriting isn't just a failing business, it's a mission. The people of Dry Willow need what we've been providing, even if they can't always pay for it. Especially if they can't always pay for it. Trust your heart, Clara. Trust your generous spirit, and trust that God will provide what's needed when it's needed most. Clara's voice broke on the final paragraph. I've hidden $50 in the coffee tin behind the flour barrel money I've been saving from odd jobs around town. It's not much, but it's enough to get you started on whatever path your heart chooses. Whether you keep the cafe open or close it and move on, know that you carry my love with you always. Give our child stories about their father who believed that feeding people was sacred work. Your devoted husband, Samuel. The silence that followed was broken only by Clara's labored breathing as another contraction gripped her. Red stood motionless, his hat in his hands, while Doc Hartwell waited patiently for the moment to pass. $50, Clara whispered when she could speak again. Hidden all this time. And he knew about you, Red. He knew you'd come back. Red's voice was rough with emotion. He was like that Samuel saw things other folks missed. Saw potential in broken-down cowboys, saw hope in desperate situations. He paused, studying Clara's face. Saw that his wife had the same generous heart he did. Doc Hartwell checked his pocket watch, his expression growing more urgent. Clara, I hate to interrupt this revelation, but your contractions are less than 10 minutes apart now. We need to focus on the immediate situation. But Clara was staring at the letter, pieces of a puzzle falling into place in her mind. Don't you see? This changes everything. What I did today emptying the till, deciding to feed everyone, it wasn't reckless. It was exactly what Samuel would have done, what he had been doing all along. She looked up at Red with new understanding. And you coming here today when you did, asking for help, that wasn't coincidence either, was it? You knew about Samuel's death. You came here specifically. Red shifted uncomfortably, his weathered face flushing. I heard about his passing from a traveling preacher, came to pay my respects and see if you needed anything. Didn't expect to find you struggling the way you were. So when you asked for work in exchange for a meal, I was testing you, Red admitted quietly. Wanted to see if you had the same spirit your husband did. Wanted to know if the cafe would continue to be what it had been under Samuel's care. Clara felt another contraction building, but her mind was racing faster than her body. The money I scattered on the table, the week's earnings, I thought I was sacrificing. Probably came from the very kind of charitable work Samuel had been doing, Doc Hartwell observed. People paying what they could, when they could, for food and fellowship they couldn't get anywhere else. So I wasn't throwing away our livelihood, Clara said, wonder creeping into her voice. I was continuing it, continuing what Samuel started. Red nodded slowly. And more than that, you turned his quiet charity into something public, something that brought the whole community together. Samuel helped people one at a time, in private. You helped them all at once, in front of each other. The realization hit Clara with the force of another contraction. The cafe hadn't been failing because of her impractical generosity, it had been succeeding because of it. Samuel's secret charity had been keeping them barely afloat, but her public feast had transformed individual acts of kindness into a community movement. "The $50, she said suddenly. "We need to get it. Add it to what we're building." "Clara," Doc said firmly, "right now we need to focus on what you're delivering, not what you're building. This baby isn't going to wait for financial revelations." But as another strong contraction gripped her, Clara felt a profound sense of rightness about the timing. Her child would be born not into uncertainty and impending poverty, but into a community that had rediscovered its capacity for mutual care. The baby would arrive in a world where strangers had become neighbors, where old feuds had been healed, and where the simple act of sharing a meal had reminded people what it meant to be human. "Samuel knew," she said softly as Red helped her settle more comfortably for what was clearly going to be a quick labor. "Somehow he knew this would happen. That you'd come back, that I'd make the choice I made, that the community would respond the way it did." "Maybe," Red said gently. "Or maybe he just knew you well enough to trust, that when the time came, you'd choose love over fear." As Doc Hartwell began his final preparations, and Clara felt her body preparing for the miraculous work of birth, she clutched Samuel's letter to her chest. The greatest gift he'd left her wasn't the hidden money or the cafe or even the child they'd created together. It was the knowledge that the choice she'd made today, the impossible, impractical, beautiful choice to empty her, till and feed everyone who needed feeding, had been exactly right. The midwife's kit had been assembled from contributions across the community in a matter of minutes, appearing as if by magic when word spread through the cafe that Clara's labor was progressing rapidly. Mrs. Pemberton had produced clean linens from her own household. Mrs. Rodriguez had contributed soft blankets knitted for her own grandchildren. And Sarah Jameson had quietly gathered towels and basin water with the efficiency of someone who remembered her own recent experience with childbirth. "This is remarkable," Doc Hartwell murmured as he examined the supplies that had materialized around them. "I've attended births in fancy houses in Kansas City that weren't this well prepared." Clara, resting between contractions on the narrow cot, Red had quickly assembled from cafe chairs and a mattress borrowed from Mrs. Pays. Pemberton's boarding house watched through the open doorway as her community organized itself around her need. The transformation was extraordinary. What had begun as a scattered group of individuals sharing a meal had evolved into a coordinated family unit, each person instinctively finding their role in the unfolding drama. 5 minutes apart now," Doc announced, checking his pocket watch after Clara's latest contraction subsided. "This little one is definitely in a hurry to meet the world." Sheriff Morrison appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased with concern. "Everything we need, Doc. I can ride to the next town if there's medical supplies missing." "No need, James. We're well equipped, thanks to everyone's contributions." Doc gestured to the improvised birthing room. "Though I have to say, in 30 years of practicing medicine, I've never seen a community mobilize quite like this." Through the thin walls, Clara could hear the ongoing activity in the cafe's main room. Instead of dispersing when her labor began, the gathered community had simply reorganized themselves around supporting her through the birth. The sound of their voices planning, organizing, caring provided a comforting backdrop to the intensity of her experience. "Mrs. Whitfield," came Tommy Jameson's young voice from just outside the door. "Mama sent me to ask if you need anything special. She says when I was born, she wanted peppermint tea." Clara smiled despite the tightening sensation of another approaching contraction. "Tell your mama I'm fine, sweetheart, but thank you for asking." Red, who'd appointed himself guardian of the doorway, managing the flow of well-wishers and volunteers, leaned down to speak quietly with the boy. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she saw Tommy's serious nod before he scampered back to his mother with his report. "That child's been asking every 5 minutes if there's something he can do to help," Red reported with gentle amusement. "First time he's felt useful in months, I'd wager." The next contraction was stronger, demanding Clara's full attention. As she breathed through it, she became aware of how the very air in the room had changed since Samuel's letter revealed the deeper purpose behind their gathering. What had felt miraculous but fragile now felt solid, inevitably as if the community that had formed around her impromptu feast had been waiting years to happen. "Doc," she said when the contraction passed, "do you think Samuel planned this somehow? The timing of everything?" Doc Hartwell, who was quietly preparing his instruments, looked up with the thoughtful expression of someone who'd seen enough of life to believe in forces beyond scientific explanation. "I think Samuel planted seeds, Clara, seeds of kindness, of community, of hope. But what's growing here today, that's your harvest." Mrs. Pemberton bustled into the room, carrying a steaming cup of what smelled like chamomile tea. "For strength," she announced, settling the cup within Clara's reach. "My grandmother swore by it during labor." "Abigail," Clara said, accepting the tea gratefully, "what you did today with Walt Garrison making peace after all these years that took courage." "Nonsense," Mrs. Pemberton replied briskly, but her weathered cheeks flushed with pleasure. "Just took finally having a reason bigger than our old grievances. Sometimes people need something important happening to remember what really matters." Through the doorway, Clara could see Walt Garrison himself, working alongside Jake and Ben to rearrange furniture and create more space for whatever the evening might bring. The sight of the former enemies collaborating so naturally filled her with a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with her physical condition. 7 minutes, Doc announced after the next contraction. "Clara, I need you to tell me if you feel any pressure, any urge to push." "Not yet," she said, though the intensity was definitely building. "Doc, what happens after tonight, after the baby comes? Do you think people will really keep coming back every week?" Before Doc could answer, Sarah Jameson appeared in the doorway, her face bright with an excitement Clara hadn't seen since before her husband's death. "Mrs. Whitfield, I hope you don't mind, but we've been talking out there, and we want you to know this isn't just about one day anymore. Mrs. Pemberton's offered to let us use her boarding house kitchen for the big cooking, and Sheriff Morrison says he'll help organize supplies from the other towns when the circuit riders come through. And I've got connections with ranchers who might contribute beef or pork when they have animals to spare." Walt Garrison called from the main room, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, those persistent pregnancy emotions that seemed even more intense now that labor was actively progressing. "You've all thought this through already?" "We're not fools, Clara," came Mrs. Rodriguez's voice, accented but warm. "We know good thing when we see it. What you started today, this is what community's supposed to be. What it used to be, before everyone got scared and stopped trusting." Red moved closer to Clara's cot, his weathered face serious. "There's something else, Clara. Something I think you should know before this baby arrives." Doc Hartwell looked up sharply. "Red, this might not be the best time for—" "It's about the money," Red interrupted gently. "The $50 Samuel hid. I helped him earn some of it." Clara's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "The odd jobs he mentioned in his letter, some of those were jobs he hired me to do when I passed through town. Chopping wood, fixing fences, hauling supplies. He paid me fair wages for honest work, then used what I was spending at the cafe to help other folks who needed it more." Red's voice grew softer. "He was creating a circle, Clara. Money coming in from those who could work, going out to those who couldn't. You just made the circle bigger and brought it into the light." Another contraction, stronger than any before, cut off Clara's response. As she breathed through it, she realized that the sounds from the main room had shifted. The planning and organizing had quieted into something more like vigil people, settling in for the long watch that childbirth sometimes required. "They're not leaving," she observed when the contraction passed. "Course not," Doc said matter-of-factly. "You're having their baby." "Their baby?" "Community baby," Mrs. Pemberton clarified from her station by the wash basin. "Child born into a family of choice rather than just blood. We're all invested in this little one's arrival." The concept settled over Clara like a warm blanket. Her child wouldn't just be Samuel's son or daughter, wouldn't just carry the legacy of one man's quiet charity. This baby would be born into a chosen family of people who'd found each other through shared need and mutual care. 5 minutes, Doc announced after the next contraction. "Clara, things are going to get more intense now. I need you to focus on your breathing and trust that your body knows what to do." As if summoned by his words, the strongest contraction yet gripped her, and Clara felt the unmistakable sensation of her body preparing for the final stage of labor. Outside, she could hear someone. It sounded like old Mr. Henley telling Tommy stories in a low, soothing voice. The sound of normal life continuing, of people creating comfort and normalcy around the miracle of birth, grounded her in a way she hadn't expected. "Red," she said when the contraction passed. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll stay. Not just tonight, but after. This community we've built, it needs you. I need you to help carry on what Samuel started." Red's weathered face worked with emotion. "Clara, I'm a drifter. Been moving from town to town for 20 years. I don't know how to stay put." "Then learn," she said firmly, just as another contraction began. "Learn the way we all learned today, that we're stronger together than apart." As the contraction peaked, Clara heard something that made her heart soar, despite the intensity of labor: laughter from the main room. Not anxious, worried laughter, but the genuine sound of people who'd found joy in each other's company. Her baby was about to be born into a world filled with that sound. "Almost time," Doc announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of experience. "Clara, with the next few contractions, you're going to need to work with your body. This little one is ready to make their entrance." Clara gripped Red's hand on one side and Mrs. Pemberton's on the other, feeling the strength of community flowing through their touch. Outside, the September evening was settling into twilight, but inside the café, a new day was about to dawn. The patchwork blanket appeared in Mrs. Pemberton's hands like a miracle woven from love itself. Clara glimpsed it between contraction scraps of blue from an old work shirt, yellow from a faded dress, red from a child's outgrown coat, all stitched together with careful hands in the past hour while she labored. "Every family in the café contributed a piece," Mrs. Pemberton explained softly, spreading the blanket across a chair where it would be ready for the baby's first embrace. Mrs. Rodriguez gave blue cotton from her husband's shirt. Sarah offered yellow from Tommy's baby clothes. Walt contributed red flannel from his winter coat. "Made it together," came Sarah's voice from the doorway, where she stood holding Tommy's hand. "Like we're all in this together." Clara felt the overwhelming force of the next contraction building and bore down with everything she had, her whole world narrowing to the powerful work her body was doing. Dimly, she was aware of Doc Hartwell's calm voice guiding her, of Red's steady hand in hers, of the protective circle of women who'd gathered to witness this moment. "Good, Clara, very good. I can see the head," Doc announced with quiet satisfaction. "One more push like that and we'll have ourselves a baby." The sound from the main room had shifted again. She could hear the soft murmur of voices, people trying to contain their excitement while respecting the sacred nature of what was happening. Someone was quietly singing. It sounded like Mrs. Rodriguez's voice, offering a gentle Spanish lullaby that seemed to wrap around Clara like an additional blanket. "Push, dear," Mrs. Pemberton encouraged. "Your little one is almost here." Clara gathered every ounce of strength she possessed and pushed with the force of all her hopes, all her love, all her determination to bring this child safely into the community that had gathered to receive them. She felt the unmistakable sensation of the baby moving, slipping free, entering the world with the urgency of someone who had important work to do. "It's a boy," Doc Hartwell announced, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "A beautiful, healthy boy." The cheer that went up from the main room was immediate and heartfelt. followed quickly by the sound of Tommy Jameson's excited voice, asking if he could see the baby right away. Clara heard Sarah gently explaining that they needed to wait a few minutes, heard old Mr. Henley offering to teach the new baby how to whittle when he got older, heard Walt Garrison declaring that he'd never seen a community celebrate a birth quite like this. But Clara's attention was entirely focused on the small, warm weight Doc placed on her chest, the son, red-faced and perfect, announcing his arrival with a healthy cry that seemed to fill not just the room but the entire cafe with new life. "Hello, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice thick with tears and wonder. "Welcome to your family." Red leaned closer, his weathered face soft with emotion as he looked down at the baby. "He's got Samuel's chin and your stubbornness, judging by that cry. He's perfect, Mrs. Pemberton declared with the authority of someone who'd helped bring several babies into the world. Strong lungs, good color, all his fingers and toes accounted for. Doc worked efficiently, tending to the medical necessities, while Clara marveled at the miracle in her arms. The baby's cries had settled into small sounds of adjustment, as if he was trying to understand this bright, warm world he'd suddenly found himself inhabiting. "What will you name him?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her voice full of gentle curiosity. Clara looked down at her son, studying his features in the lamplight. She'd thought about names during the long months of pregnancy, had discussed possibilities with Samuel before his death, but now, holding this child who'd been born into such extraordinary circumstances, only one name felt right. "Samuel," she said softly. "Samuel Hope Whitfield." "Hope?" Red asked with a smile. "For what he represents, for what we all found today." Clara adjusted the baby in her arms, feeling him settle against her warmth. Samuel for his father's legacy, hope for his future. The baby chose that moment to open his eyes dark blue like most newborns, but alert and aware in a way that seemed almost miraculous. Clara felt as if he was looking directly at her, recognizing her voice from the months he'd carried him. "Look at that," Doc murmured. "He knows his mama." From the main room came the sound of quiet celebration people, sharing coffee and the remaining food, voices full of joy and satisfaction. Clara could hear Tommy asking questions about babies, could hear the gentle responses from the adults who'd appointed themselves his teachers and protectors for the evening. "They're waiting to meet him," Red observed. "In a few minutes," Clara said, unable to take her eyes off her son's face. Let me just look at him for a moment longer." Samuel Hope Whitfield had been born into a world where strangers chose to become family, where old wounds healed through shared purpose, where one woman's impossible choice had created something beautiful and lasting. As Clara held him close, she felt the presence of his father in the room, not as grief or loss, but as blessing and continuation. The baby was home. The birth record would forever show Samuel Hope Whitfield, born September 15th, 1892, at sunset, in the presence of community. Doc Hartwell's careful handwriting captured not just the medical facts, but something unprecedented in his long career. A birth, attended not by hired help or distant relatives, but by a chosen family of strangers who'd become something precious in the space of a single day. "Hope," Doc repeated as he signed the record. "I like that. Lord knows this town could use more of it." Clara cradled Samuel Hope against her chest, wrapped in the patchwork blanket that represented every person who'd gathered to witness his arrival. The baby had settled into the peaceful sleep of the newly born, his tiny fist curled against her collarbone, his breathing steady and strong. "Are you ready for visitors?" Mrs. Pemberton asked gently. "They're all eager to meet him, but they'll wait as long as you need." Clara looked toward the doorway, where she could see the anxious, hopeful faces of her community peering in. Tommy Jameson stood on his tiptoes, trying to catch a glimpse over the adults' shoulders. Old Mr. Henley clutched his hat in both hands, his weathered face soft with wonder. Sarah Jameson had tears streaming down her cheeks, remembering perhaps her own son's birth and the joy that had been tempered by loss. "Yes," Clara said softly. "Let them come meet Samuel Hope." They entered quietly, reverently, as if approaching something sacred. And perhaps they were this child, represented more than just new life. He embodied the possibility that had bloomed among them during the day, the proof that choosing generosity over fear could create miracles. Tommy was the first to speak, his young voice filled with awe. "He's so small. Was I ever that small, Mama?" "Smaller," Sarah replied, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "All babies start small and grow big with love and care." "Well, he'll have plenty of both," Walt Garrison observed, his voice gruff with emotion. "Between all of us, this little one's going to be spoiled with attention." Mrs. Rodriguez approached with her own contribution, small wooden cross she'd carved while waiting for the birth, its surface smooth from careful polishing. "For protection," she said simply, placing it in Clara's free hand. "My grandmother say, first gift to baby should be blessing." "It's beautiful," Clara said, closing her fingers around the warm wood. "Thank you, all of you. I never imagined when I woke up this morning, I never could have imagined ending the day like this." Red, who'd been standing quietly at the foot of the bed, stepped forward with his own offaringa, small wooden horse, carved with surprising delicacy from a piece of scrap wood. "Every boy needs a horse," he said simply, "even if it's just to practice on before he gets the real thing." Clara felt fresh tears start. Those pregnancy emotions weren't going away just because the baby had arrived. "Red, it's perfect, but more than that," she looked up at him with sudden understanding. "You're staying, aren't you? Really staying?" Red glanced around at the faces watching him, at the community that had somehow claimed him as completely as he'd claimed them. "Well, someone's got to teach this boy how to carve proper horses, and help his mama run the weekly feasts, and—" He stopped, his voice catching slightly. "And I reckon 20 years of drifting is long enough. Time to put down roots." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge catching the lamplight. "If you're staying, Red, we'll need to make it official. Town could use a deputy, especially one who understands the kind of community we're building here. And we'll need help with the café," Clara added, looking down at Samuel Hope's sleeping face. "I have a feeling it's going to be busier than ever." "About that," Mrs. Pemberton said, pulling the community ledger from her apron pocket. "While you were in labor, we did some planning. Sarah's agreed to help with the cooking, Walt's going to coordinate supply runs from other towns, and I'll manage the weekly organization. But Clarathis is still your vision, your café. We're just here to help it grow." Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her and her newborn sonfaces that had been strangers this morning and were family now. The transformation seemed impossible, but the evidence was right here in this room, in the warmth of their presence, in the way they'd naturally organized themselves around her needs and her child's arrival. "Samuel," she whispered to the baby, though she was speaking to his father's memory as much as to the child himself. "Samuel, look what we built. Look what you started." Doc Hartwell checked his pocket watch and began packing his instruments. "Well, medically speaking, both mother and baby are doing exceptionally well. But I suspect this little one's going to have the most unusual childhood of any baby born in Kansas territory." "Good, unusual," Tommy declared solemnly. "Like having lots of grandpas and grandmas and aunts and uncles who chose to be family instead of just being born that way." "Exactly like that," Clara agreed, understanding for the first time that Samuel Hope would never know what it meant to be truly alone. He would grow up surrounded by people who'd learned that community was something you created through choice and care, not something you inherited through blood or circumstance. As the evening deepened outside the cafe windows, the community began to settle into a comfortable rhythm of taking turns holding the baby, sharing stories about their own children or childhoods, and making gentle plans for the future. The weekly feasts were no longer a possibility, they were a certainty, anchored now by something even more powerful than Clara's initial generosity. They were anchored by love. The new cafe sign swayed gently in the March breeze, its hand-painted letters catching the afternoon sunlight. Samuel, Clara's community kitchen. Red had worked on it for weeks during the slow winter months, carving the wooden frame with the same careful attention he'd once given to breaking horses, painting the letters with a steady hand that spoke of patience learned through hard years and unexpected grace. 6 months had passed since that September day when hunger had brought him to Clara's door and generosity had transformed them all. Now, as he stepped back to admire his handiwork, Red could hardly recognize the town around him or the man he'd become within it. The Saturday feast had grown beyond anything Clara could have imagined in those first uncertain moments when she'd emptied her till onto the table. What had started with 15 people gathering around mismatched tables now drew visitors from 3 counties, turning Dry Willow into an unlikely destination for those seeking not just food, but the kind of community that seemed to be disappearing from the modern world. "Sign looks good," Clara said, emerging from the café with Samuel Hope balanced on her hip. At 6 months old, the baby had become the unofficial mascot of the weekly gatherings, passed from hand to hand among people who'd appointed themselves his extended family. Today he was dressed in a tiny shirt Mrs. Rodriguez had sewn from scraps of the patchwork blanket, and his bright eyes tracked every movement with the alert curiosity of a child who'd never known a moment without love and attention. "Suits the place," Red replied, wiping paint from his hands on a rag. "Though I never thought I'd see the day when Dry Willow would need signs to handle all the visitors." It was true. The town that had been dying just months ago now showed signs of genuine renewal. The general store had reopened under new management, a family drawn by stories of the weekly feasts and the community spirit they represented. Murphy's saloon had been transformed into a boarding house for travelers who came for one Saturday feast and found reasons to stay longer. Even the train made extra stops now, conductors knowing that passengers would find hospitality unlike anything available in larger, more prosperous towns. "Mrs. Pemberton says we're expecting 43 people today," Clara reported, settling into one of the rocking chairs Red had built for the cafe's front porch. "Including a family from Colorado who heard about us from those trail riders who passed through last month." 43, Red mused, shaking his head in wonder. "Remember when we thought 15 was ambitious?" Samuel Hope chose that moment to reach for Red with chubby arms, making the small sounds that had become his way of demanding attention from his favorite adults. Red took the baby with the easy competence of someone who'd become a natural uncle, settling into the chair beside Clara's. "What do you think, little man?" Red asked the baby. "Think your mama knew what she was starting when she decided to feed every hungry soul in the territory?" Clara laughed, the sound carrying the confidence she'd gained through months of successfully managing what had become the most unusual restaurant operation in Kansas. "I think your mama was just trying to do the right thing for one hungry cowboy and ended up discovering that doing right tends to multiply when you're not trying to control it." Through the cafe's open windows, they could hear the familiar sounds of Saturday preparation, Mrs. Pemberton directing the bread-making operation with her usual efficiency, Sarah Jameson consulting with Walt Garrison about the supply arrangements, Tommy helping old Mr. Henley set up the carved wooden toys that had become his contribution to the community gatherings. The weekly routine had evolved into something sustainable and self-organizing. People contributed according to their means and abilities. Farmers brought vegetables and grain. Ranchers provided meat when they could spare it. Travelers shared news and stories from other places. Townspeople offered labor and local knowledge. The cafe's books, meticulously maintained in the community ledger Clara had started that first day, showed a modest but steady profit that surprised everyone except Doc Hartwell. "People need what we're providing," Doc had explained when the first month's accounting showed they'd not only covered expenses but had money left over for improvements. "Community's a scarce commodity these days. Folks will pay for it, even when they can't pay much." The extra money had gone toward practical improvements, more tables and chairs, better cooking equipment, a small addition to handle the growing crowds. But more importantly, it had gone toward expanding their mission. The cafe now served free meals twice a week to anyone who needed them, had established a small lending library in one corner, and provided informal job placement services for travelers looking for work. "Red," Clara said, watching Tommy chase a butterfly across the dusty street while his mother prepared for the evening's guests. Do you ever miss it? The traveling, the freedom, to move on whenever you wanted? Red considered the question seriously, his weathered hands gentle as he helped Samuel Hope grip a wooden rattle Mr. Henley had carved. I thought I would. Spent so many years convinced that staying put meant getting trapped. But I've learned something these past months. What's that? Freedom isn't about having no commitments. It's about choosing the right ones. He gestured around Themat, the bustling café, the renewed town, the network of relationships that had grown from a single moment of desperate generosity. This here's the freest I've ever felt, because it's the first time I've chosen something bigger than just surviving day to day. Clara felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing how profoundly people could change when given the chance. Red had arrived as a broken-down drifter, asking for work in exchange for a meal. He was leaving the conversation as deputy sheriff, co-manager of the most successful restaurant in 3 counties, and unofficial grandfather to a baby who'd never lack for family. Samuel would be proud, she said softly, looking down at their son, who was contentedly gumming his rattle while studying the world with bright, curious eyes. Of all of us, Red agreed, but especially of you, taking that leap of faith, choosing hope over fear that took more courage than most folks manage in a lifetime. As the afternoon sun slanted through the porch roof, casting warm shadows across the weathered wood, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been a pregnant widow, struggling to maintain a failing cafe in a dying town. Today, she was the center of a thriving community that drew people from across the region, a mother raising her child among a chosen family that grew stronger with each passing week. The weekly feast that was about to begin would be filled with familiar faces and new ones, with stories shared and connections made, with the kind of abundance that came not from having plenty of money, but from having plenty of love to share. And in the center of it all would be Samuel Hope Whitfield, growing up in a world where his mother had chosen generosity over scarcity, where strangers had become family through the simple act of sharing meals, where one woman's impossible choice had reminded an entire community what it meant to truly live. The sign above them swayed gently in the breeze, promising all who passed by that here, at least, the American dream was still available to anyone hungry enough to believe in it.